Welcome, and thank you for coming. We're here today to talk about the financial challenges of retirement, particularly with a focus on employees in the public sector. For a long time, they've depended on pensions as a source of income in their later years. What used to be considered a supplement to their income is now considered by many as a sole source of income in their later years. This is sad because a lot of these pension funds are grossly underfunded. 80% is considered healthy, but 38 states are considered underfunded by this standard, 9 of which are below 60% funded.
So these are the top 10 least and most funded pension ratios according to Bloomberg. This ratio is calculated as the actuarial value of the plan assets divided by the projected benefit obligation, and the data is collected from the comprehensive financial reports that every state has to report. What's interesting is the discrepancy between the least funded state, which is Illinois at 40% funding, and the most funded state, which is Wisconsin at almost 100% funding.
So in 2009, one of our panelists, Dr. Joshua Rao, along with Robert and Marj, did a study trying to find the true value of these liabilities, and they used the widely accepted 8% discount rate. Under an actuarial estimate called the accumulated benefit obligation, they came up with $2.76 trillion.
So most public pensions report the present value of their liabilities at discount rates that are representative of the expected return of assets. States actually encourage, government accounting practices encourage states to try to fund the pension liabilities so that the expected future value of the pension assets equal the expected future value of the pension liabilities. The problem with this is that it ignores asset allocation, which can, obviously create different outcomes. It also ignores the very certain nature of pension benefits from the past, which is why Rao and Novi Marx decided to put this to the test by testing different discount rates. One discount rate that was used was the Treasury rate, and this is based on zero coupon yields, and it's supposed to reflect the default-free nature of these securities. And he also used the taxable muni rate, which is similar to how high-grade bonds are discounted. So these were the findings of the report. He tried finding the aggregate accumulated benefit obligation of the liabilities from June 2009. And he found that at the discount rate of 8%, it was $2.76 trillion. But when he used the taxable municipal rate, it came out to $3.2 trillion, and when he used the Treasury rate, it was $4.43 trillion, which begs the question as to which is the correct rate based on the certainty of these obligations.
So obviously, this brings a lot of challenges for employees that are going to retire in the public sector going forward in their lives. So we brought the panelists here today to talk about that. We have Marjorie Adler, former Chief Human Resources Officer for the City of Coral Gables, Miami-Dade, and Philadelphia Public Schools, and Deputy Mayor for Operations for Philadelphia and Human Resources for several operating divisions of Sunoco. Jeremy Gold, Ph.D. from the University of Pennsylvania, former head of Morgan Stanley Pensions, and consulting actuary for Buck Consultants, actuarial consulting and state systems development for pension consulting firms and insurance companies. Dr. Joshua Rao, Professor of Finance at Stanford Graduate School of Business, former Associate Professor of Finance at Kellogg School of Management, Northwestern University and University of Chicago Food School of Business. Dr. Brown, William R. Hough Associate Professor of Finance and MSI Program Director, will be moderating. Actually, we'd like to present the first question to Dr. Joshua Rao. What inspired you to publish research on this topic, and what has been the reaction since then?
Well, thanks very much for the great introduction and the extensive work you've done on this topic. I'm very impressed with the synthesis of the research you've put together. So my history on this topic goes back to actually looking at companies that sponsor defined benefit pension plans. I guess I'd always been interested in issues that were on the border of financial economics and public finance. So issues that really thought about public sector funding liability problems, doing so through a financial lens. And that goes way back to things that I did actually, between college and graduate school, I worked at an investment bank in London, the group that sort of analyzed economic data and fiscal policy announcements for the currency and bond traders of the bank, and had always sort of kept my eye on public finance issues alongside issues in financial economics. I did a Ph.D. at MIT, as was mentioned, and I was working on how pension funding requirements impacted corporate activities. I was very interested in this idea of the notion that if, say, General Motors has to contribute an additional $1 billion, say, to their pension fund, does that have any impact on their operations, which has a lot of tie-ins to sort of major issues in corporate finance. And I wrote a series of papers about corporate pension policy, really from the thinking from the perspective of corporations. And at some point, someone said to me, "Well, look, companies aren't really they're trying to get out of the business of providing defined benefit pensions. Companies now, you goes and work for a company, you're not going to have a defined benefit pension. You're going to have a 401k." And I thought to myself, well, that's true. And I think the person who was giving me this advice sort of said, maybe you want to work on something else. And at the time, I started looking around and thinking, okay, well, there still is this large public sector that provides defined benefit pensions to public employees. And when I started digging around, it was a revelation to me just how large that sector was and just how large the liabilities were. And furthermore, I noticed that when I started looking at these reports, I noticed something that I think Jeremy Gold has known for many, and others have known for many, many years, which is that the methods that are used in measuring liabilities in these reports are completely at odds with the most fundamental principles of financial economics. The most fundamental principles that we, every class I've ever taught is sort of, Finance 101, on the first day, you got to discount a stream of cash flows at a discount rate that reflects the risk properties of that stream of cash flows, not whatever return you expect or target or hope to achieve on some assets that you set aside. And so the state and local governments, I noticed, were violating that principle. And I noticed there had been some writings, primarily by Jeremy, a few other prophets out there who had understood this issue for some time. And I said, okay, what can I do now to shed some more light on this? And I started doing valuations of the systems using appropriate discount rates. That's kind of a history of how we got started.
What benefits do you think are served from not evolving from pensions to, let's say, 401k contributions for the public sector, that they would continue to provide pensions to their employees?
Do you want me to take that? Yeah. All right. So I think one of the upshots of this report that you've put together is that these plans are very, very underfunded, and that they are, in order to fund them and to provide the pensions for the public employees that they have been promised, a lot of money is going to have to come from some other source. And the other source is probably going to be increased taxes or other services being cut. Okay, so that's kind of the upshot of the report. The question then becomes, what is the alternative model? And you mentioned the alternative model, potentially 401k, moving to a 401k type of system, which is the system that workers in the private sector have access to and are offered. And I think one of the challenges in confronting this major public finance issue with the unfunded pension liability is that the 401k model has not exactly been a resounding success for providing retirement income security for many Americans. A lot of people have not contributed. A lot of people have made bad asset allocation choices. A lot of people have tried to time the market and found that they bought the stock market in early 2008 and sold it in mid-2009. Okay, so people have not exactly made great choices, and so the alternative model doesn't look that great either. So you asked me you sort of put it in the way, what are the downsides? Well, the downsides are that 401ks haven't really done such a great job. And I think that what do we do now? We have this extreme. Public sector is on these, what I would argue, very by and large, mismanaged and falsely accounted for defined benefit pensions that are exposing taxpayers to large unfunded liabilities. The private sector is on these 401ks that's kind of not adequate for people's retirement. What do we do? What's the way forward? We can talk about this more as the session goes on, but I personally think there's room for more hybrid vehicles that kind of combine the two things.
Good. So I want to first questions, I've got a few questions. Must have read my mind. The first question you asked was along the lines of what I had in mind, but I'll ask some questions and then we'll, of the panelists, and we'll interject questions along the way. But just for everybody to get a grasp on it, and Josh and Jeremy probably have the numbers on top of their heads, but just to magnify, or to put a magnitude on this concept. We were reading the newspaper today, and Florida, which is a modestly underfunded state as things go, in order to be fully funded to pay the liabilities of the benefits accrued today to the workers in this plan is $767 per household in the state of Florida to write that check. And the numbers in Illinois would be.
This is per year. This
Right.
is this would be a per. This every household would have to.
Per year they have to write it, which is per year 767. What's the number in Illinois? You put on the spot.
Oh, it's,
I mean, I've read it.
Illinois is more like 1,800.
$1,800 a household a year.
Of additional increases to state revenues that would have to come from households.
It's,
What's interesting about that in our state is we're in a state where those citizens, those households, don't pay any personal income tax at the state level. Many of these other states already are taxing their citizens at some rate in the state itself. We don't have that here.
So along the lines of the idea of changing from a defined benefit to a defined contribution plan, in the corporate sector, that's taking place rapidly. And part of the motivation of changing to a DC plans is they're much cheaper. And so I wanted to ask the panelists, and probably start out with Marj, do you see that same dynamic happening in movement to DC in the public pension plan arena?
I think the movement toward DC in the public is certainly inching along very, very slowly. I think in terms of my own work and experience, what we are seeing is unions, which are strong in the public sector, are gradually looking at ways to change the nature of the DB plan, even if it impacts those that are in the plan, to do that, whether it's a changing of the formula, whether increasing the time for vesting, how final average earnings are defined in many instances, and we were talking about this at dinner last evening. Overtime is counted in those last years. And I know from experience, police and firefighters in many municipalities and jurisdictions now are willing to forego that in order to preserve the DB plan, so that they will have lower income, but it ain't low because of all the overtime that's already there. But there are ways, they are working on ways to do that rather than see them frozen. But it's going to happen. I watched the city of Coral Gables, Florida, which is a small place but has its own pension plan. It chose not to be in the Florida state plans, which sounds fine from the outset, but then it puts commissioners who are not necessarily fairly sophisticated, a small jurisdiction. So if the unions want to defeat you for voting poorly from their perspective on aspects of this, you'll lose. Simple as that. And they'll look from a budgeting, do it from a budgeting point of view of, gee, we can afford, without raising property taxes, to fund X million dollars to the pension plan. Well, then they'll back into how underfunded they'll let it be, and what the discount rate. I mean, they play with the discount rate in order to manage the amount they have to pay.
So is it, I'll ask the question, but it's mostly for emphasis to say it again out loud, but it seems like the major distinction between the evolution that we've seen on the public side, or lack of evolution on the public side, versus the evolution we've seen on the corporate side, is public plans are highly unionized.
Well, I wouldn't, yes, but it's, and political, whatever, whether it's union or wherever the pressure comes from.
So
It's a political environment, and the political animals are going to respond that way.
I want to pose a question, and then I want to take a vote among you guys, and then Jeremy's going to give us the answer. Okay. So sorry to take over here, but okay. So true or false? Defined benefit plans are more expensive than defined contribution plans. Okay. Raise your hand if you believe that statement is true. Okay. Raise your hand if you believe that statement is false. Okay. Jeremy, what is the answer? What is that?
If we're going to provide the same level of retirement,
Well, yeah.
then properly measured, the cost is the same.
The cost is the same. And that's a really key.
Hey, I got that.
You got, yeah.
We
yeah.
didn't prep that.
Yeah, I know we didn't
Wow.
prep it, but Jeremy and I are on the same wavelength. So I think that's like a really important thing to understand, which is that, a defined benefit pension it's really just providing the employees with a with a security or an asset in retirement that is, you could think of it as a deferred annuity or a ladder of bonds with some mortality probability in there. And one could do that in the context of a defined contribution plan as well. The reason that people say, you tend to think, okay, defined benefit is more expensive than defined contribution, is that now we've gotten very far behind on funding the defined benefits. Sure. And now we got to plow all this money into it. People are saying, oh, wow, it's so expensive. 20, 30 years ago, one of the reasons that people did defined benefit instead of defined contribution was they thought defined benefit was cheaper. Because, hey, you don't have to put as much money aside and we get these great benefits. Well, when you hear something like that, something must be wrong there, right? If it seems like you get something better by setting aside less money, then something must be incorrect in the calculation.
Well, there's a whole aspect, too, of whether or not employees contribute, be it DC or DB, and you'll find more DB plans where now the employee's responsibility for contributing to that has increased. That is something that politicians seem to have been willing to take
But I
on.
want to put Jeremy on this spot, because I got the answer wrong, but I'm going to rephrase the question. So I agree that there.
By the way, that's a great technique. If you don't like the answer, just tweak the question.
So, well, Josh's question was sufficiently vague that we could have had, but certainly and we had talked about this at breakfast, so there are a DC plan and DB plan can always be constructed. There's a payout, an annual contribution to a participant in a DC plan, or a formula that defines annual benefits through the rest of your life in a DB plan. And those they can be equivalent, and we understand how they're equivalent. And then the DC plan need not be more expensive than a DB plan. But in practice today, if you were to take the DB plan of you don't know the plan, but let's guess the Coral Gables firefighters compared to a DC plan in a normal corporate world, which one of those would you guess is the most expensive?
Now, we're comparing corporate to public.
I'm taking a DB plan that has the normal benefit, 2% times the number of years and that annuity formula. Those plans I think, are quite expensive relative to what benefits are offered in a DC plan.
In a DC plan in a corporate environment, you're going to see the employer costs below 5% a year, as a percent of payroll. So for every $100 you earn, they put $5 aside,
Right.
or less. And in a DB plan in a public sector with 2% benefits, you're going to see costs, depending on whether they're uniformed or not, of 15 to 35% of payroll.
Right.
And in some of the more mature plans, and by mature I mean they've got a lot of people who are already retired, who have earned a lot of benefits, and they've underfunded it. And if they're uniformed, by which I mean fire and police, a fair accounting for the annual cost might be 100% of payroll.
Yep.
So between what you're looking at for a DB plan in place today, relative to what benefits will be typically offered in a corporate DC plan, there's somewhere on the order of anywhere between 3 to 20 times more lucrative.
But one of the probable outcomes, I think, of pension reform in places where it happens is that either there will be defined contribution plans implemented,
Right.
okay, or there will be reductions in the defined benefit generosity. And I think what's interesting is I would predict that in order to get public employees to accept defined contribution plans going forward, those are going to have to entail some pretty high contribution
Right.
rates. Okay, so I mean, is your point? I mean, the costs of some of these public pension plans could be up to 100% of payroll, if you wanted to try to replace that DB with a defined contribution plan, can you imagine saying, well, now we're going to have a defined contribution plan where we're going to contribute 100% of your payroll every year? I don't think taxpayers would put up with that, but it illustrates the fact that the defined benefit plans that are currently now offered by public employers are generally quite expensive and generous.
You know, the idea that moving from DB to DC, whether led by the corporates or invented by the publics, that I get a tone, a sense that in this room that's viewed as progress. Am I right? You can nod your heads. Certainly your question implied that, well, when are the public plans going to get on with it and move to DC like they should? So let me state my prejudice right up front. I'm very much a supporter of DB rather than DC. On the other hand, I'm one of the great critics, along with Josh and a few others, of what's wrong with these DB plans. Among other things, as you toss these ideas around, we have two kinds of transfers. DC plans would be kind of naturally attractive in this room because DC plans favor younger workers over older workers, and DB plans should be particularly unattractive based on their history, because what they've done is they've accumulated enormous liabilities and passed them on to you. So, but those are two separate transfers. One is between young and old at any time, and most of you will be old at some time. And the other is between one generation and the next generation. The DC plan is pretty clean on the intergenerational issue, but it is a major shift, and it puts a burden on 25-year-old new employees to start saving like they took retirement seriously, which they don't. You may, because you've had more exposure, but most 25-year-olds just kind of shrug. In fact, there are many reasons why serious saving for retirement, no matter what the mechanism, could very well begin in the early 40s, and we would still have a viable system. Because before that, you're forming families, you're buying houses, you're taking on debt, you're furnishing. But there comes a time, and it better be long before 60 or 65, when savings must occur. And the DB plan pattern is actually more like that than the DC plan. DC plan would have you saving right from the get-go, and believe it or not, that doesn't make things cheaper, it just makes the timing different. If you're borrowing to buy a house and investing in a DC plan at the same time, and the mortgage rate is higher than the earnings in the DC plan, that's not a good transaction. So you need some context for this. I'm not going to go and defend DB versus DC at this exact moment, but I do want to be on the record as favoring DB. I also want to say that one of the big reasons, and I think we've already alluded to it, that it's so hard to root out DB. And remember, I don't want to. But if you do want to, in the public sector, it's so tough, not only because unions are unionized, but because they don't only trade labor. In the private sector, unions trade their labor for wages. In the public sector, they trade their labor plus their votes.
I just want to, real quick, because I think I made the point that DB and DC could potentially be equivalent, but that requires the DB to be well managed. And I think where you and I, Jeremy, maybe diverge a bit on this is that I just don't think that there's practically no municipality out there or state out there that has really got the discipline to be able to manage a DB plan the way that you and I would like to see it. I think you're more sanguine about that. But my perception is that state and local governments will always give in to the temptation to want to promise a nice benefit and then set aside less money today to fund it than the present value of that benefit and take on risk to try to achieve that. And that the cost of that will then always be hidden from taxpayers. And so for that reason, I am less sanguine about the DB model being a good one for public employees, although I certainly recognize, as I started out saying, that a well-managed DB in a DC can provide the same level of benefits.
Let me just amplify Josh's point. I was asked by a conservative think tank to opine on, which I neglected to do or declined to do, on the Florida's planned conversion to a DC plan, and they pointed out, as Marj has, that a lot of the reason that we're underfunded is because not only of the large promises, but because of poor investment performance. And my response was, and it was poorly understood by a number of people who have asked me about this, is that there's absolutely no reason that that investment performance has to be inherent, or investment risk has to be at play in a DB plan. You can buy long duration bonds and you can match that liability and you can save money, put money away and defease those liabilities. There's no reason that a DB plan that says that a DB plan has to have investment risk inherent in it. Many corporate plans don't, but I think, as Josh has pointed out, public plans are likely to always have investment risk. It's too tempting.
Especially with GASB.
I shared Josh's concern about the poor management, and it's not just investment management, but the poor management of DB plans, particularly in the public sector. But the solution that you're not quite advocating is we're going to take the control out of the hands of these incompetent bureaucrats and put it into the hands of these unprepared employees.
Well, I'm not going to advocate that, because that goes to the answer. I'm not going to advocate, I don't advocate 401ks, but I do advocate a collective defined contribution type of approach for the public sector going forward, which would be one where a pooled defined contribution, where there could be some baseline guarantee, but to some large extent, employees basically would own shares in the Florida Pension Fund 2, if you will, and then they would receive annuities upon retirement that are the basis of the performance of those shares. And that's the model that, say, TIA CREF has followed for a while in a number of the products that they offer. So that would be because again, I started out saying I think that 401k has also not been a solution. But on the reason, I just want to elaborate a little bit on the reason why I see this mismanagement and false accounting of the public pensions continuing for the DB plans at the state and local government level is because they're just following the Governmental Accounting Standards Board rules. And so, one of the defenses that one often hears is, okay, we're just, we're following the GASB rules, and hey, Rao, the stuff that you're doing, by the way, that's not in keeping with the GASB rules. You're off in some other accounting world. But the fact is that the GASB rules themselves are not in keeping with the principles of financial economics. And so the GASB and the GASB rules are the ones that say, that basically guide the state and local governments to discount their obligations at an expected return on assets, with some asterisk now that if you get very underfunded, you may have to use some lower rates for some very long-term, et cetera. But the point is that in a regime where that is the accounting, it is just going to be too tempting to promise fixed benefits and try to fund those with a high degree of asset risk. And you've got a measurement that will never properly reflect to the public the true costs. So I think without changing GASB, if we could change GASB fundamentally and do it the right way, then I would become more optimistic.
And I tried. I was on their advisory panel, and I helped design their interrogatory that they sent out. And but I want to generalize slightly from what you just said. A first step in any form of financial management, and particularly financial risk management, is proper measurement. First, it is not a certainty that good measurement will lead to good management. It is, however, a certainty that bad measurement will lead to bad management. And we have had an extraordinarily long period of bad measurement. But I do want to point one thing out. This bad measurement was entirely in the opposite direction throughout the 1980s, and in fact, at every period up to around a crossover point in 1990. The measurements were leading to overfunding of these public plans. because actuaries were using 6% and working their way up to 7 and then 7.5 as the long Treasury bond was declining from 14 to 12 to 10. And around 1990, they crossed at 8. And the Treasury bonds continued down to about 2.5, and now they're just below 3.5. I'm talking about the longest bond. At the same time, the actuaries got up to 8 and said, well, who wants to lower it?
Exactly.
And that's when you get essentially a political problem. We didn't have a problem raising it. That was always welcome. But the actuary who says, I want to lower the rates, will be fired and replaced by an actuary who's willing to keep that. Now, in the very last 2 or 3 years, and I think a part of the credit for this goes to Josh and Robert Novi Marks, we've seen those rates begin to come down. We're probably, on average, as much as 50 basis points below where we were 3, 4 years ago. Does that sound right? Across the
Almost
spectrum?
50, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, let's not go
Let's go
overboard and call it
maybe
50.
I'd say 40.
Okay. You understand these rates are 400 or 500 basis points too high, and we're talking about whether they've adjusted them 50 basis points or 40 basis points in the right direction.
Jeremy, I want to go back. You're in love with the DB. And
That's just, I will stipulate that I didn't quite say that, but
what about addressing portability and vesting? I don't know the turnover rates in public employee funds, but I do know the turnover rates in corporate. They're huge. And aren't you penalized at 4.5 years? You don't want to leave Dow Chemical to go work for DuPont because you got to wait that extra 6 months. Is there something we can do to address that to make the DB more portable?
we could. I really think that if I go down this, I will drag us in the wrong direction.
Okay.
Well, I'm actually very interested because I wanted to.
Here we go.
We're being dragged.
There is an element that I want Marj to opine on about the DB and DC decision process. And Josh and Jeremy have, I think, gotten us very far. I can't think of anything they've missed on the financial economics of accounting for those liabilities and the investment risk and who bears them. But the DB plans as we see in the public sector today, I think, and you wouldn't be shy to correct me if I'm wrong, have, from vesting requirements and the way they're and the way the benefits are done, have pretty significant distortions in the labor market for public employees, school teachers, things like that. Do you agree?
What do you mean by distortions?
People stay
Oh.
in one job much longer than they'd like, or
Absolutely,
they stay in the profession.
absolutely, and the portability is a big piece of that.
Yeah.
And because the plans aren't the same, it's hard to define what that portability would be. I'll leave these two to opine on that, because I don't know.
But it's an issue.
But it's a big issue. It's a big issue. And people do stay longer and sometimes forever in those defined benefit plans because
Just because of the economic incentive.
absolutely because of the economic incentive and the security.
Remember
It's there.
I'm sorry.
And that's certainly true on the uniform side. I mean, if I'm a police officer in New York or, San Francisco or Coral Gables or wherever, and I want to be a police officer, I'm probably going to stay there once I vest. And the same thing with a firefighter. On the non-uniform side, it's probably less, particularly at the lower levels. But once you're vested and that security is there, it's a security blanket.
Can you change the date at which I'm eligible? Some of the students know from a military background, and if you spend 19 years and 6 months on active duty in the U.S. military, you get a 50% annuity of your salary immediately. You can go on to another job and you draw that annuity, presumably money good as long as you live. When do the uniforms draw that annuity?
Uniforms draw that 20, 25 years.
If I'm a teacher, when can I draw it?
Oh, it's generally, most of them are now, I think, 30 years, 32
they're
years for
different-
full.
It varies.
Oh, much
Rules.
different, much
We're
different,
getting more complicated.
much different, much different. And teachers don't have the overtime opportunities in the very direct, clean way that you calculate
You mean the
overtime.
spiking that
But they
Jeremy
do have-
explained to me last night?
You mean at the end of your career?
Can the two of you talk about
Oh.
that a little bit?
Well, I mean, I watched it in Philadelphia, and I watched it in Coral Gables as well, with, separated by like 20 years, so it's still going on. If your final average earnings calculation, or part of the DB calculation is, say, a 3-year or 5-year, highest 5 years or whatever, everybody knows Jeremy's 5 years from retirement. We'll let him have the overtime because we know we'll get ours when we get there. And it absolutely balloons the final average earning, which of course costs a pension plan forever.
Is
on that
pretty much
stuff.
everyone in the room familiar with this idea of final average earnings being part of a defined benefit plan?
I'm not sure they are.
Okay. If you work in a defined benefit plan and you use the example of 2% credit per year, and you work there for 20 years, you get 40% of something as an annuity. Well, 40% of what? Well, it's 40% of final pay or final average pay,
As defined.
as defined in the plan. And in the corporate sector, when they had many of these final average plans, as they were called, we were looking at 5 years, and we would exclude overtime. We might exclude bonuses. We certainly were not giving credit for unused vacation pay. But when you shift into the public sector, not only do we include overtime and unused vacation and sick leave, but we don't average over 5 years. And pretty much we don't even average over 3 years. 3 years is now sort of the top in the public sector, and frequently it's 1 year. And so you don't have to have Jeremy within 5 years of retirement. Who's up? Who's up for overtime? Well, Joe's retiring 12 months, and that's how it goes.
But I have seen some changes to elongate
To
those
stretch
things,
those, yeah. Well, that's the cost control, yeah.
vacation and
Although what I have found
sick time out of it.
particularly
As you should.
particularly surprising is, I mean, there have been some attempts to eliminate this idea that you can spike the pension. There's some proposals in pension reforms in states around the country, and in many cases that has been turned down on the idea that the right to spike your pension is in some sense a vested right that one has as an employee. And so that gets to, I'm sure, a topic that we'll get to soon or later during the panel, which is, what exactly are the rights of public employees who have been promised these plans, and what exactly are the is the set of entailed in the set of possible public policy measures that could be taken to try to change
Yeah,
that.
that was, I want to move into that next, but I'll take a few questions at this point, yeah.
One question from Marj. It feels that stability issues can be fixed fairly easy by adjusting the way you calculate benefits. And so every 6 months you work, your benefits go up by the proportion. So why isn't it being done? And could it be intentional by the employers, but to keep the employees from leaving?
There's that, to keep them from leaving, but I think what's important to remember in public plans, the trustees of that plan, some will be representatives of taxpayers generally, but there are always representatives from the unions involved, at-large people from that, and as I think Josh mentioned, people have their votes. So it's very hard to do in terms of getting the unions and the trustees that they either own or influence to accept those changes. I've seen it happening as the underfunding increases in certain plans. The unions are far more sensitive to that because they do get it. They're not unsophisticated folks at all. Would you agree?
No, they
They are, it's very
they've
often
done
they're
a better
more
job.
sophisticated than the management
The
side.
unions have
Yeah.
done a better job on behalf of their constituents
Right.
than elected officials have done on behalf of the taxpayers.
No
They
question.
just, they just keep winning. Or they have, we may have just about crested, but they were just much better agents on behalf of their constituents than the elected officials have
So
been.
that
But I also-
Perversely, that ranks Illinois #1. I want to work in Illinois.
Well,
Unless you have some doubts about their ability to pay.
Okay.
As long as, if 5 years ago, we had no doubt everybody would get paid. And yeah, you want to work in the laxest state. And
but I think,
Chicago would be better than Illinois in that regard.
but I think where the union's savviness, if there is such a word, in doing this has also made them, in more recent times, more receptive to changes in those DB plans, which will help the underfunding issue going forward. And that's been a positive thing. I think it's very slow in coming. And when I look at the numbers and the percentage of underfunding, is it enough soon enough? But I think they are moving. I have something I want to ask later, but I'll wait, because
Well, I just
it's
wanna
way
touch
off
on
this.
One concept, because it's new for the class, and I think the panelists have fleshed it out in pieces. But the benefits that are offered to DB plan workers, especially uniform, are profound. And a large reason that we're in this unique, incredibly lucrative benefit space for uniform workers is that they're unionized and they vote. And in the political spectrum, that's in the public pension plan, that's incredibly different than anything else I've heard. And I can speak from firsthand, because when I was in middle school, I lived one town away from the border of Chicago in the suburbs. And they passed a law, and a number of my friends ended up moving 4 miles because their fathers were firefighters in the city of Chicago. And there was no question why they did that, because they wanted to make sure that they're going to keep their benefits together, that they all showed up and voted. And so they made a law that if you had to be a firefighter, if you were a firefighter in Chicago, you had to live in Chicago. And that wasn't because you were closer to the firehouse. It was because to make sure that you voted.
And where they don't vote, they lobby. The single most powerful lobby to the Florida retirement system is the International Association of Firefighters.
Can I just say something about why that's changed a little bit, or why that is changing? You alluded to the fact that in Illinois, at least, in places where there are severely underfunded pension systems, there's something that's starting to turn a little bit in terms of the strategy of the public employee groups. And I think that's, if you think about it, so Illinois in the state constitution has a provision that says the benefits accruing to public employees in this state may not be diminished or impaired for any reason. So for the past, decades, public employees have approached this as saying, it doesn't really matter whether Illinois or the city of Chicago puts money into these plans or not. Taxpayers will always be placed on the hook to pay for our pensions. If it has to be done in real time as a pay-as-you-go plan, then it will be done in real time as a pay-as-you-go plan, but the taxpayers will always be asked to somehow come up with the money. Now you look at, recently we've had developments, you look at some of these city of Chicago plans, the plans for uniform employees of the city of Chicago. Those are plans where there are actuarial calculations that are done, but the actual contribution rate is just a fixed percentage of pay no matter how far behind you get. That's also the same way that the teachers plan in California works. And as a result, those plans have gotten severely underfunded to the tune where if you properly measure the police and fire plans in Chicago, these are less than 20% funded. So they're coasting into as a pay-as-you-go territory, which would be disastrous. And what has changed is now that some of the public employee constituents in Illinois are saying, well, wait a second now. The Constitution says these things may not be diminished or impaired, But if there's just no money there, how sure are we that we're really going to get every cent on the dollar? And in particular, will they try to chip away at the cost of living adjustment? Will they be able to force through the idea that we can't use overtime? Will some of these changes actually get made? And what we've seen is a bit of a change in the dynamic where there have been some tendencies to maybe have some concessions on the benefit promise side in exchange for funding the promises that are already there. And it is an interesting, perhaps unfortunate fact that the places where you've seen these reforms are the ones that are close to having a major crisis because they haven't been responsible in the past. In a sense, places that have created their own crisis are now forcing the issue.
Josh, does that mean the shadow of Detroit is cast over Chicago? Is that not lost, or are people aware of that?
I think people are aware of that. I think there are two views of that. One is, on the one hand, Detroit had its own problems that to some extent were specific to the auto industry. On the other hand, what they really, what ultimately, the sort of ailment to which they ultimately succumbed was the public employee pension issue. And the way I view the public employee pension issue is that it's an ailment, it's a sickness that basically is, afflicting everybody. But of course, the sickest patients are the ones to the patients who are already sick from other maladies are the ones to be, taken first by.
The annuitant.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So let me phrase a question that looks like we're headed towards that I was interested in asking and prepared for the panel. So I'll read it out loud. Large underfunded pension plans played a large role in the Stockton, California, and Detroit bankruptcies. Do you believe that ending in bankruptcy will be the norm, or will current taxpayers be motivated by higher municipal bond rates and ability to attract worker concessions, or some other form of addressing the problem? So do you think that there's a chance that this will be handled gracefully, or do you believe that it will these will just systematically end at a point where they go bankrupt?
Are you asking me?
We're asking all
Yeah,
of you.
Marj.
Okay.
And we're looking at you.
We're looking at you.
I wanted to ask
I'm
a
looking
real
at you.
simple, tight question that was narrowly defined.
I think people will wake up before we have a lot more Detroits and Stocktons. I really do.
You've seen, to interrupt, sorry to interrupt, you've seen concessions on the workers' side.
Absolutely,
Josh.
absolutely, absolutely, and changes to make that more possible. I also think that you have to look at, okay, what happens if they fail? Where does the support come from? Are we going to let people starve to death? I mean, what's, all of those kinds of things, which I don't see happening. So I do see movement coming, but I think it does take, on the management side, pressure and push to do it. I mean, for instance, this is a very small example, and there are obviously bigger ones, but it proves that it can happen. The Coral Gables Commission has not approved, the pension board has approved a COLA for the last couple of years based on the investment performance, according to the formula. And the commission has overruled it and not given out COLAs for the last 2 or 3 years. So, I mean, those kinds of things can happen. The one thing I want to mention, but I don't want us to forget it, and I think it's very astonishing in the Detroit figures, only I don't have them in my head or in front of me, that the liability on the health care benefit side is much larger than the liability on the DB payout itself, and that I think is a place to really
Is that because it's
look at as
easier
well.
to promise health benefits?
It's
Probably.
also, importantly, somewhat easier to rejigger or renege on health care benefits. They're not as constitutionally protected, even in the major we divide states into those that are constitutional states, which is really the situation Josh described in Illinois, from those that aren't. But even in these constitutional states, the health care benefits are nowhere near as well protected. They are much more negotiable. Particular form of negotiation presently is simply to increase the pay-ins by active employees, a larger percentage of your pay going into health care, and smaller payouts to those collecting benefits through higher co-pays and deductibles, and those are not limited by the constitutions in most of these states.
Do you see that
And I
happen-
am not a lawyer, and so I'm not allowed to have these opinions.
Do you see that happening aggressively now? I mean, I assume it will tomorrow, but what about now?
I don't know. We do have, of course, a fairly large health proposal working its way through this nation. And I think sort of everybody's holding their breath a
Right.
little bit to see what the effect of Obamacare might be.
And one of the potential sort of locations where public employees who might at some point be dumped from the public retiree plans, public retiree health plans, would actually be on the ACA exchanges.
Right, they're sending them to the exchanges.
To the exchanges.
They just did that someplace.
Yeah, yeah.
Was it Illinois?
It,
One of
it might have been. It might have been proposed in Chicago.
Okay,
But
yeah.
you know, I just wanted to on the bankruptcy, on the Chapter 9 bankruptcy issue. You know, this is a question that often comes up. You know, is Chapter 9 bankruptcy the way that we're going to go to try to deal with these issues? And I think one observation we have to make here is that in the places that have done Chapter 9s, it's been revealed that actually Chapter 9 bankruptcy does not seem to be that good of a way of dealing with the pension issues. So let me give some examples. So in Vallejo, California, that was they did a bankruptcy in 2008. So that was one of the in the sort of recent spate of them. That was one of the earlier ones. The judge in that case gave the city the full right to renegotiate all contracts, including pensions. But the judge can't impose any solution on the city. He can just say what can be done and what can't be done. And so the parties all sat down, and my kind of simplistic view of what happened there was, you know, you had the representatives of the public safety officials on one side of the table, you had the city manager, and then you had the representative of the bondholders or of the bond insurers. And you know, they said, okay, well, stuff has got to get cut here. Who are we going to cut? And the representative of the bondholders pointed to a stack of papers about this big and said, well, you owe us this, and you owe us this, and you owe us that. And the representative of the public employees said, you still got to hire us tomorrow to keep safety on the streets and put out the fires at your houses. So we suggest that you impair the interests of the bondholders, not of us, regardless of what the judge said. And ultimately, that's what happened. In Vallejo, those bondholders had their positions cut. And Detroit, I think we're seeing something similar happening. Initially, they were talking about 35% cuts in the pension benefits. People called me and said to me, see, Josh, they're cutting the benefits. They're going to get out of this by cutting the benefits. I said, just wait. What happened last week or 2 weeks ago? They actually had something that would be a deal where there would be no cut in the pension benefits. So what seems to be happening is that regardless of what the legal seniority is of the pension benefits, bankruptcy, Chapter 9, is revealing that, in fact, in many cases, pensions are ultimately senior to a lot of other obligations. And I would just add that there are also many states in which Chapter 9 bankruptcy is not an option for the municipalities. And we have no state-level bankruptcy code. The state of Illinois cannot declare bankruptcy, for example, nor can the state of Florida or any other state. So it's not clear that bankruptcy even really helps us address these
Josh,
issues.
could you just take for the benefit of the class, just another look at Detroit, and if you can encapsulate it quickly, give the students a feel for the ripples of that and how it even reached into the Detroit Art Museum and what that produced. Because it was an interesting, to me, sideshow that had some impact.
Yeah. Well, you know, Detroit had about 40% of the total debt that was attributed to Detroit around the time of the bankruptcy was related to unfunded pension and health obligations. I believe the total number was $19 billion that they were throwing around. Is that?
In simple terms, it's 3 for pensions,
Yeah.
6 for health, and another 9 on top of that for bonds. So
For
you
bonds.
get 18 or 19.
18 or 19 billion, okay. But of course, the pensions are way undermeasured because they're measured using, you know, I think 7.5% discount rates in the city of Detroit. So in fact, those are much higher. But where the art museum and other issues came in was the question was, okay, well, where can we possibly get some funding for this? And one of the ideas was, let's, you know, sell everything that's not nailed down to the ground that we owe, including art and the art museum and other things. Because in a bankruptcy, you know, they're looking for any sources of revenue that they can possibly obtain. And I think it is quite interesting that, you know, obviously Detroit has not yet reached a resolution, but is headed towards something where the pensions are going to be largely preserved. And it is the other claimants, and those other claimants are not just the bondholders, but also the recipients of public services and the people who enjoy the public services, including the people who visit the art museums, that are going to bear the brunt of this. So the way I see the role of Chapter 9, as I see it, seems to be a way of, these city bankruptcies seems to be a way of basically forcing the public more quickly to bear the brunt of paying for the pensions through other cuts. That just seems, in just an empirical observation of Detroit and other cities, that seems to be what Chapter 9 allows us to do. So I certainly hope that Chapter 9 bankruptcies are not the way that we're going in large scale.
I just had a question about sort of when these benefits preserved in these Chapter 9s and other negotiations occur, which will actually preserve the benefits, and the bondholders end up getting hit primarily or first and foremost. Is there going to be sort of, or do you see a situation where the states that go into these situations first are going to exit on the other side in a position where they're, I guess, the least competitive? They'll have to either have higher taxes or lower abilities to attract capital and businesses to their areas, and sort of creates a vicious cycle where it's just going to start repeating itself, and you have citizens fleeing because taxes go up.
It's a great question.
Great question. Who wants to
Well,
address that?
Josh mentioned that labor says you have to hire us tomorrow. Similarly, the investment banks say you're going to want to borrow tomorrow. So there is an argument which notionally is equal, but in practical political terms, you may have to borrow tomorrow, but you only have to pay another 150 basis points on your borrowing. The money will be there. And additionally, bondholders don't vote. So the net effect is what Josh says. It's a lot easier to cut the bondholders than to cut the employees or the retirees. A little bit of history on additional on Detroit. The art museum, which was worth several $100 million, by which we don't mean the building, we mean the art, seems to have been rescued by essentially philanthropists who said the rough equivalent of, look, we'll buy the art and give it back to you. And now you can take our $300 million and help to balance your balance sheet. 340?
340, yeah.
Okay. But there were a couple of other miracles that went on, and because I'm an actuary, some of these are near and dear to my heart. First, when they reported the $3.5 billion shortfall, which is what the, I guess you know there's a city administrator appointed by the state named Kevin Orr, who kind of outranks the mayor, and he's the emergency manager. Well, he hired a different actuarial firm. The original actuarial firm had said we have a $600 million unfunded, which in the light of the entirety here is really quite trivial and manageable. The second actuarial firm came in and said, no, it's really $3.5 billion. But they did that by lowering the discount rate from 7.9 to 7. But Josh and I would like to see that done at 3.5. And I've estimated that at least before the recent rise in interest rates, a better measure than $3.5 billion would have been 7, 8, or 9 billion. But now, through another actuarial miracle, it's almost zero. And how did this occur? After they got the money from the philanthropists and they started to put the pieces together, just last week we had an actuarial miracle. The actuaries took a look at 1 year's investment performance and said this is so favorable that we can raise the assumed return going forward. And instead of using the 6.25 that was built into the 35% and 4% cutbacks, they went quickly up to 6.75 and closed most of the gap. This is incredibly good news. You can get your actuary to find $1 billion with the stroke of a pencil. A money manager of my acquaintance used to walk around with a pencil like this. We had trouble. We went to visit the Department of Labor. They weren't sure what to do with this pencil as we went through security. And he called it the actuarial pencil. And he says, this is a miracle worker. It can wipe out debt. It can wipe out liabilities. It's just fantastic. My concern, though, and I think Joshua shared this, is if you got into this trouble in large part, although still less than half of your trouble, but you got into this trouble by mismeasuring everything in sight, how comfortable can we possibly be when we get out of it by mismeasuring again? This story isn't ended.
I just want to make sure that, because it's a humorous anecdote, and we should elaborate on it for those people who aren't fully grasping the arithmetic at this point. But sort of what happened in Detroit was that with a robust stock returns, right, equity returns, and so the stock market went up, pick a number 10%. But through the magic of actuaries, the value of the liability was increased by decreased by 10 times that because of a bizarre calculation. So small, modest increases in the stock market should reflect value of assets, but they also, oddly enough, reflect the value of the liability at multiples, several times that.
I mean, the trick is really pretty simple. I mean, I have in my writings, a number of examples of, fallacies of expected return discounting. Jeremy has some as well. One example that I like just to make, and this is a bit of an oversimplification, but it definitely contains the essence of the thing. Suppose you made a deal with somebody, you borrowed $100,000 from someone, and that person, let's say they just gave you a zero interest, zero coupon loan. So essentially, you borrowed $100,000. You're going to have to repay them $100,000 in 10 years' time. Okay. Now that loan, if you had a balance sheet, would have some value. There'd be some discount to that. But let's not think. Just suppose that you've borrowed $100,000. You owe this person $100,000 in 10 years' time. Okay. Let's say you take that $100,000 and you spend half of it on a car. Actually, not a car, because that's an asset that's potentially repossessable. A vacation, the best vacation that you've ever had. Okay, $50,000 on a vacation. It would be the best vacation I'd ever had. I don't know, maybe some of you have had better ones, but that'd be pretty good. Okay, so the money is gone. You've spent it. You've enjoyed it. Now, most just common logic would say that now, if you were going to have a household balance sheet or a personal balance sheet, that would have to reflect some debt or unfunded liability, because you borrowed cash from this person, and then you just spent half of it, and now you've only got half of it. Now you have 10 years, but you've only got half of it. But the sort of Governmental Accounting Standards Board logic would say the following. Because portfolios of stocks and bonds have grown at an 8% compound annualized return over the past 30 years, that means they've roughly doubled every 9 years or so. You could just maybe assume that $50,000, if you set it aside in a diversified portfolio, is going to double in 10 years, and you'll be able to repay your friend. So according to that kind of logic, that governmental accounting logic, you could do this transaction and think of yourself as having not incurred any debt from that thing. It's as though it would be as good as you're having borrowed the $100,000 from the friend, put the $100,000 in a bank account, and left it there for 10 years. That would be treated equivalently to taking the $100,000, spending half of it, and putting the $50,000 in the diversified portfolio of stocks and bonds, and arguing that it's going to equal $100,000 in 10 years. And that's essentially what the state and local governments are doing. It's about how they're representing their position and what they've done. And
it's funny, we think of it the same way. I mean, you're forced at times to intuitively describe the fallacy of the discount rate. But if you have this liability and you use the diversified portfolio, let's say the value of that liability is $1 billion. If you use the correct method, it's $2 billion. What that means is that $1 billion in a well-diversified portfolio is worth as much as $2 billion in a bond portfolio. And if you really believe that, then I want to sell my bonds to you.
Yes. Yeah, right. Under this governmental accounting, $1 of stocks is worth more than $1 of bonds.
That's right.
And in fact, Robert Novi Marx, my co-author, has constructed some great examples where you'd rather have, for the purposes of stating your liabilities, you'd rather have only $10,000 in stocks than you would $10,000 in stocks plus $10,000 in bonds. So burning money actually will improve your funding status under these GASB rules.
And that, and I want to get some more questions, but if that's not lost on all of us, I mean, that's a big part of that mismeasurement that Jeremy and Josh and Marj talked about, and the inability that you can't manage correctly, we're never going to manage correctly with mismanaged numbers. I mean, one of the pieces of that other academics have looked at is, some evidence that suggests that ownership of risky assets, equities, may be done by public pension plans for the express purpose of raising that fallacious discount rate, and that could be a tremendous distortion on equity.
The last 5 years, corporate pension plans have been de-risking. And they've been getting rid of a bunch of investments that I consider to be the dark side. And I do that because there's a little light shown on them. The hedge funds, everything that's called alternate investments. Part of the attractiveness of that is nobody knows the right number, so you can put a favorable number on it. So they've often run to this dark side now. Where was I going with this?
Public plans, on the other hand.
Pardon?
Public plans, on the other hand.
Well, oh yes. So as they've been selling this stuff, they've been very lucky because the public plans have been buying it up. So the exit strategy for the corporates is the publics. What is the exit strategy for the publics? Well, it's you. It's the next generation of taxpayers. That's the exit strategy for the publics.
If the flaws in the risk, the discount factor and the risk probabilities and stuff are so evident and so obvious, and there's such a consensus, then are there more efforts to try to educate the public and the people, and why is it not gaining the traction that it should?
Well, I always like to quote the old adage that it's very hard to make someone understand something when their job or their livelihood or their pension depends on their not understanding it. So, because I think the issue is that if public employee groups were to accept this logic, they fear that there would then be a backlash or that their benefits would then be cut. And I think that is, if the logic that Jeremy and I and basically all financial economists know, if that logic were accepted, then the public would have to realize that there's a huge hole here. How would that hole be made up? Likely there'd be I think there'd be a lot of shared pain. I think there'd be tax increases, spending cuts, and probably benefit reductions where they where they are. So I think that's one of the reasons. I tried to undertake some public education initiatives. I did a MOOC on this topic. I'm gonna repeat it. Trying to just show the math behind these issues. But it's difficult. It's also hard to get over this very it's just complicated enough that you have to know a little finance to get it. You have to understand a little finance. People who kind of defend the status quo can just say, look, over the last 30 years, these portfolios have earned compound annualized returns of 8%. So really these guys, Gold and Rao and all these others, they're just pessimists. They're just trying to rain in the parade. They're pessimists, and maybe even they want to try to deconstruct the government and fire public employees and things like that. It's a very easy argument.
Not Gold, just Rao.
Okay, just me. Fine, I get that. I hear that kind of thing a lot. And
I do too.
Couldn't be farther from the truth. And so, but that's a very easy argument to make, especially. People just, they returned 8% in the past. Why not 8% going forward? I do think we made some progress. I think that, everyone knows that past performance is no guarantee of future performance, but these pensions are guaranteed, and most voters will realize that there is something wrong with that.
And even the past performance. We've had 30 years of secularly decreasing interest rates. That is a powerful driver of asset values. And so even something like MAP 21, where the advocates argue that you should consider the fact that these liabilities are overstated, they assert, because the interest rates today are artificially low because of the Federal Reserve.
Yes, it's artificial.
They very conveniently ignore the fact that the quantitative easing has had a similar, maybe even larger effect on the asset side, but that doesn't need to be fixed because it's a little less direct. So there are tremendous vested interests in continuing to mismeasure. You've suggested that we might find a smooth glide path. I think it's going to be quite rocky. We may be sending the bluefin down to look for the remains one day of these pension plans. And they're going to take pain out of everybody, as Josh pointed out. They are really going to inflict pain, well, on a whole generation. In fact, even your parents will get to enjoy a lot of that pain, because it turns out that we have now become the generation that Josh and I were worried was going to have to pay up. 12, 14 years ago, when we were writing things, we were saying future generations are going to have to pay. We are now our own future generation, and the bill is coming due quite quickly.
Before I ask another question, I want Marj to tell me why this just isn't going to work, because I've always wondered. I mean, we developed and fleshed out very well these vested interests, and I think concessions for existing workers, uniforms, and whatever, it just seems like a folly. The political power is so high. But what about something where, starting tomorrow, the next firefighter that's hired, the next school teacher that's hired, the next uniform that's hired, we can offer them a much different package. Would the unions protect the next firefighter or just the existing one?
Well, it's interesting. The whole notion of two-tiered
Right.
wages, whatever, has been fought for, God, since I was first in
Ever.
school years ago.
Since ever.
Forever. But I think you gradually are seeing it
Right.
in some instances. I think the uniforms will be the last place you see it, just because of number one, of their power, and also of their expertise in this, of fending that off. But I think it's coming, and I'm sure it exists in some places already.
Yeah, we think about
But-
Social Security, right, taking away existing people's Social Security benefits doesn't seem to be plausible, but the next generation of people that come into Social Security.
Right, well, I mean, people having to retire later, changing the formula depending on where I think those are real ways to do it. They're slow, and you argue that my glide path is too smooth.
Well, I'm making a
but I
prediction,
think
I
it's
guess,
pretty.
is what
But
I'm
I think
doing,
it's
yeah.
pretty steep.
Right.
Yeah.
I think it's pretty steep.
You've seen that.
It seems like a major today to mismanagement of defined benefit plans, but to the flip side of that, is it a fair assumption to believe the average person has a financial wherewithal to plan out what kind of retirement they want in a defined contribution plan?
I would say, I don't know about the average person, I would say there's a significant portion of the population that is not going to do that adequately. And that's why, in general, I much prefer the model of a pooled defined contribution plan, where, again, it's, there still would be pension funds that are managed on behalf of a large group of people, but without the extent of the guarantees. On the other hand, I do think there are many people who are capable of doing it on their own, and we should find some way of allowing them to do it on their own.
And I would suggest that one structure that allows both of those things is a DB plan with assets that match the promises, but with variable annuities, so that employees who wish to expose 50% of their future retirement income to the stock market could do so. And for every dollar that they moved, the investment would also change to match it. So the taxpayer's risk would not be changed. Taxpayers would basically be paying for a modest benefit determined at bond rates. And then the employees could swap their fixed rate annuity for a variable rate and change it many times during their career. And that's not too far from some of the things that you mentioned. TIA, CREF offers us. New York City school teachers have had that kind of plan in their 403B, where you can go variable or fixed. And that allows individual choice. The unions don't actually like individual choice. They really do, as you point, they don't want stratification because they want everybody in the same boat. But classic or neoclassical economics says that you're going to get the best results when each person selects their own exposure to risk.
But I think you kind of posed the question, why is it that it's so difficult even to move new employees onto a defined contribution plan or a new model? Why is it that there's such resistance to this stratification? Because one can make the argument, well, hey, I mean, why isn't there, I would think, that there might be some resentment building among these, say, public safety forces in cities like Chicago, where the pensions are so poorly funded, because the young people are saying, And by the way, many of these public safety officials do not have Social Security. They are only counting on the pension. So if I'm like a 30-year-old, policeman, and I'm looking at the people who are, who have just retired, and I'm seeing my contributions are going into this system, those are basically going directly out to this older individual. I would think that in and of itself might stir up some resentment, and maybe what's going on is that the older generation doesn't want to lose that contribution source to the defined benefit pension from the younger.
Their political clout too, as they shrink and as they move on and retire.
Remember, if you went to a DC plan tomorrow, you'd still have all of the existing unfunded costs that you'd have to pay.
Sure.
In some ways, you'd be double paying. And in a DB plan properly accounted for, while the cost of a uniformed who's a year away from retirement may be 100% of pay, the value earned by a brand new 25-year-old employee may only be 1% of pay in that first year, maybe 2% in the most generous of plans. In DC plans, we're always going to actually pay them more than that. So at least in the short run, we're really going to be raising the cost, because the promise to those brand new entrants is really modest. If we managed it correctly, it's 1 or 2% of pay. And suddenly we're going to put them in a 4 or 6% DC plan while still paying off all the old costs. So you have that mathematical problem in addition to all the political ones. I think the mathematical ones are dwarfed, but you will often hear, don't forget when you move to a DC, you still have to pay for all the DB promises you made. And that's the short form of the same concept.
Josh, how did it come to be? It shocked me when I read that the Detroit people weren't in Social Security. How did that come to be, and how widespread is that?
Well, when the Social Security Act was passed in the 1930s, there were a number of public employee systems at the state and local government level that predated that were already in existence. And so, and many of those systems didn't want to be part of Social Security. They said this looked like a bad deal. Social Security looked expensive to them. So what the Congressional Act did at that time was it basically offered it said members of public employee retirement systems do not have to participate in Social Security. The systems as a whole, so each individual system can opt in at any point they want to in time. They may not opt out once you've opted in. You may not opt out.
It's the Roach Motel.
The Roach Motel, yeah.
They still haven't.
And many have opted in, but I would say systems that cover around 30% of public employees have not yet opted in and don't intend to do so. That does tend to be a lot of the municipal systems, public safety officials, et cetera. Do you have a perspective on why it is that those in particular didn't opt in?
Well, let me make a case for why they shouldn't opt in.
Mm-hmm.
If we look at the current structure of Social Security, if you earn anywhere near the earnings base for the year, what is it, close to 90,000, something like that?
110 now.
110. If you earn that, you are paying more in economic terms than you're getting out.
Everybody understand that the Social Security
Has bend points. I'm sorry, it works the other way. The first 30,000 of your earnings gets rewarded this much. The next 20 or 30 gets this, and then it gets flat. So what happens is there's a great shift, and it's deliberate, and it's not something that I oppose, but there's a shift from the wealthier employees to the poorer employees, which means that just on that basis alone, if you are planning to be a wealthier employee, and you were offered the opportunity not to participate in Social Security, that would be a good decision.
Yeah.
To compound that, if I were career planning for a 25-year-old, 22-year-old police officer, and he said, well, at 47, I'm going to retire from the police force, and I would say, and then you're going to get another job as a security consultant, and you're going to earn almost 3/4 as much in Social Security system as if you'd been in it from age 22 to 47. From age 47 on, you're going to earn so much under Social Security, again, because Social Security can't tell the difference between a poorly paid worker through a lifetime and somebody who has 2 careers and only works. They both look poor to the Social Security system, they're both favored by the Social Security math. Now, there are many justifications for how Social Security works, but on the margins, it works very badly, and so these decisions are really quite rational.
Of course, but I mean, the other side of that is, of course, that, I mean, public employees, the private sector, all private employees who make close to that earnings cap, they are being, shall we say, charged for the underfunding of Social Security, unfunding of Social Security, but public employees are not. And I guess one question, I mean, actually Peter Diamond and Peter Orszag had a proposal where they said you could close about 10% of the Social Security, the unfunded Social Security liability by requiring public sector employees to be in Social Security. I mean, I guess the question is, do you think that public employees should be exempted from Social Security or not? Or should they be allowed to have that exemption?
Ooh, that's actually an actuarial question. The
Yeah.
answer is, on an actuarial basis, they should not be exempted.
Yeah.
If you're going to design a social insurance system,
Yeah,
we all have to get in the pool.
yeah.
But for every problem, there are a multitude of narrow-cast solutions. One proposal is, gee, if we just open our borders, that'll solve Social Security. Every one of the solutions takes you into another trouble space. So, you know, things don't change very quickly, and often there are fairly good reasons why they don't. It's because the solution that solves this problem is coming right out of another problem space. And so it just makes people equally mad politically.
So more immigration would help Social Security. But
Let's talk a little bit about politics and because the Social Security came up. So we've had lots of commentary about, you know, how this will work and will the voters sit up straight and the important part of unionized voters. And we talked a lot about this political dynamic in here. If we want to look for a separate laboratory, Social Security is an example of another hugely underfunded program, and it doesn't have the union capacity or the union element to it. But have anybody seen a politician that's seriously willing to address underfunded Social Security? And if they're not, then how would we expect them to do it in Florida?
I want to make an argument in favor of underfunded Social Security.
But I don't want you to do that. Go ahead.
Well, but I mean, it may sound strange because, well, first let me say that as a financial economist, venturing into Social Security takes me out of my really strong zone, puts me into the area of macroeconomics. But here are some of the important differences between Social Security and a public pension plan. Social Security is a citizens plan in which we are essentially paying ourselves. And we're all in it, except for we should all be in it.
Right.
And it is, as I'll argue in a moment, it may not be necessary to fully fund that as we go. On the other hand, when we talk about the workers in California, they are the employees of the citizens of California. And intergenerational equity requires that we pay their full compensation every year as they work for us. And to do that, we must fully fund the pension promises as we make them. Or at least that's the perspective that Josh and I share. And it's an intergenerational argument. It's one very comfortable for financial economists. Let's go to Social Security. Social Security are a bunch of promises we make to ourselves. What do we buy with Social Security? We buy a lot of goods that don't exist today. This is true of what the retirees do, but what are we buying? We buy a bunch of things to feed us, to clothe us, to house us 20, 30, and 40 years from now. Those things don't exist today. So what is a Social Security benefit? It is, in fact, a promise. It is a claim on future goods, most of which are perishable. So how do we run this as a society? What does it mean if we put pieces of paper into a trust that represent ownership in the corporate? That would be what funding would be, wouldn't it? It would be pieces of paper in a trust that would represent ownership of the future producers of all those goods. I have a son. If I went into an arrangement with him and I said, why don't you take over my business? And he said, and I will support you in your retirement out of that business. If the business prospers, I will be fed. If the business goes bankrupt, I will starve to death. That's how it is with perishable goods. If I said to my son, now I got another idea. I'm going to give you shares equal to half the business, and I'm going to keep the other half of the shares. Now the promise you made to me is funded. Well, now if the business does well, I'll eat. And if the business goes to hell, I will starve to death. So the moving of those pieces of paper representing future claims don't do very much. They do, however, one other thing. If you put equities into a Social Security trust, there is a paper from 1944 that says a government that borrows and invests in equities can be equated perfectly to a tax on the equity risk premium. In other words, if the government owned 5% of the United States equity, that would be the same thing as if they charged a 5% tax on returns on equity in excess of bonds. So interestingly, the proposal to put securities, corporate securities, into the Social Security Trust Fund is equivalent to taxing the owners of equities, which is to say it's a tax the rich program. And that is the Clinton-Gore program. The Bush program, on the other hand, said, we're going to put the money into separate accounts where if you guys invest in equities, you'll get the same benefits you were entitled to all along. This amounts to putting your benefits at risk when they used to be guaranteed. So not surprisingly, just as Clinton-Gore contrived this scheme which amounted to a tax on the rich, the Bush program amounted to a reduction in benefits. And now I have something good to say about actuaries. Actuaries have said forever that to balance Social Security, you only have two choices. You can increase taxes or reduce benefits. Clinton-Gore increased taxes. Bush reduced benefits. They both did it, however, under a disguise of investing in risky assets, because as we all know, risky assets in the long run can buy you a free $50,000 vacation. And as financial economics teaches, there ain't no such thing as a free vacation. I believe that's exactly the word.
I'm pretty sure. No, but it is interesting that the Bush plan, I mean, it did have this element of, you know, okay, the employees currently have these guaranteed benefits. Now we're going to offer them something where if this expected return is realized, they'll get those same benefits. So in a sense, they were, you know, taking the same discussion that we're having now about public employee pensions and trying to use that as a way of selling individual accounts to citizens. I mean, you know, my personal, I mean, on Social Security, I mean, I think I agree with just, you know, most of what you said. I do think one of the issues with Social Security is that we didn't build in any automatic stabilizers to Social Security for the demographic problems that we're now having. You know, there's no maximum percentage GDP that could be spent on Social Security. There's no sense in which if the actuarial projections are wrong that there's any automatic stabilizer. We have to go back to Congress every time for fixes. Sometimes they've screwed up those fixes and then fixed them again. And it would be, I mean, I would be more comfortable with our pay-as-you-go Social Security if there were some automatic stabilizers in there. But I can't really point to a country that has those, so I'm not, maybe I'm living in a dreamland.
It strikes me that fixing Social Security is a lot easier than fixing the public employee pension.
I agree with that. You know, one of the reasons is that, I mean, the public employee pension is, as Jeremy pointed out, it's, you know, we've got a situation where sort of 90% of the public owe this very, very large debt to 10% of the public, and that 10% of the public are people who provide us with essential services every day. That's a difficult situation. And secondly, these public employee pensions have in many states and in many instances been ruled as contracts. They are contracts. And if you want to change that, then you're running up against a whole bunch of contract law. If you want to change Social Security, if the federal government says tomorrow we're changing the COLA and Social Security, I can't sue the federal government and say you've breached the contract. So it's a very, it does seem that there's a lot, and also there are just many technical fixes that would put Social Security on a much more sound footing. They're changing the indexation.
Robert Posen suggested an interesting idea. Right now, Social Security gives full cost of living to everyone collecting it. And there have been proposals from time to time that be reduced. And Robert Posen had a scheme where benefits for the higher paid would be indexed on a lower basis than benefits for the lower paid. And it actually seemed to me to be, in the heat of that debate circa 2005 and 6, after Bush's re-election, it was somebody who was willing actually to stick their proposal in the middle of two sides, which otherwise were, as we now know, screaming at each other at the top of their lungs. He came in and made a suggestion which would appease the left by penalizing the higher recipients and protecting and would appease the right by putting the system on sounder footing. Everyone else was on one side or the other. He actually stepped in the middle, and as every good suggestion does, it died.
Maybe that was helpful.
What about taking the age 70 cap off and appealing to the gambling nature in some of us? You get an 8% return for every year of your full retirement age till 70 if you elect to postpone the Social Security. Take the cap off. Let people roll the dice. I'm not going to take a I'm 80. I'll take your 8% every year. And the government will be rooting for me to die at 79 and never collect a penny. What's wrong with that?
That's freedom gone amok.
We got one back.
So the proposal that was decreasing the benefits for the people that were of higher income, was that accompanied by a reduction in payroll taxes? Because there would be
No, because the problem was the payroll taxes were not quite sufficient. Maybe they were 2% a year short, 2.5%, of being able to pay for Social Security in the long run. But it wasn't directly to lower benefits for the higher paid. It was to lower the automatic increases in benefits. It was to lower the cost of living indexing for the higher paid. And may also have entered into the AIME. But it wasn't necessarily, it was all prospective, as most suggestions have to be in this area. And it did, I'm just trying to correct my own shorthand, which you reflected, which is it attacked the higher paid. It did, but not quite as directly as I made it sound.
That's a solution that is very progressive in the sense that Social Security is then balanced by, this is a way of reducing the benefits of higher income earners or reducing the return of the higher income earners receiving Social Security. The other ways of doing that include raising the earnings caps, and there are various other ways of doing it progressively, and there are ways of doing it less progressively, and that's where a lot of the debate comes down. It's just who should pay for it. But again, just to come back to what you said, Jeremy, I mean, Social Security is, it's a tax on us to pay us later. And there are issues with what kind of return we're actually getting on that. But it's a lot easier to deal with that kind of issue than a tax on us to pay somebody else, right? A tax on you to pay me or me to pay you. It's just a much trickier problem. And we also, some people also say, well, look, the public sector. I mean, again, this is only 10% of the U.S. population, maybe 30 million people. How can this be such a big problem? And it's, in some ways, maybe it's not even as much about the size of the problem, which is in the trillions, as it is about the costs and what's the workout mechanism going to be. I mean, Greece was only 2% of European GDP, but it rippled through everything because there was no sound workout mechanism. And what's the workout mechanism when you have a city like Chicago that's heading towards a situation where the people who provide essential public services are promised these benefits, and there's just not going to be money there to pay for them? I mean, I think we're going to see a lot of social unrest surrounding this.
One of the difficulties in negotiating with uniforms, and I take this from New York City, which is a very strongly gun-controlled neighborhood. There are not guns in New York City. But when you negotiate with the police officers and they take off their jackets, they all are wearing holsters with arms. And now you have to tell them you want to lower their benefits. So that may not apply nationwide. Your mileage may vary, but.
Do you think one of the fatal flaws with Social Security is that it is, correct me if I'm wrong, in a sense, a social Ponzi scheme? So it seems that my generation is going to be funding the baby
There is a windfall generation, which is just about dead, who collected roughly 10 trillion more than they put in. The present Social Security structure, my understanding is, will leave us that 10 trillion short. Maybe it'll grow with interest, but we're not really adding to that debt. We are passing it along without paying it off. So it's true that your actual dollars show up in my bank account. But the benefits you're earning are roughly equal to what you're paying. And again, maybe there's a small gap, but it's less than the 2%, because the 2% would pay off, 2.5 would pay off the legacy costs in 75 years.
Yeah, but it would leave you with a large unfunded after 75
Well, that's
years. So
another problem with that
I don't think I
particular
agree with your
metric.
statement that we're not accruing more unfunded benefits because of the demographics. I'm also not an expert in Social Security.
Yeah.
But I think, again, to go back to something I said before, I mean, the idea that there is some base pay-as-you-go pension system is, in and of itself, not necessarily problematic, but as with everything, it's the way that it's implemented. This system was not structured in a way that would have any kind of automatic way of dealing with these demographic shifts. And I think that I wish that the authors of Social Security and of other systems around the world had done some more thinking about what those demographic shifts might look like and have some more forethought of, but that's probably wishing much skill on for our
So
legislators that they
If
don't
I
have.
can rescue my question that started this out. Well, Jeremy helped me out a little bit, but I was a little surprised by your answer that, that there wasn't intergenerational wealth transfer inherent in the current Social Security underfunding. Let's suppose that at some level there is. And Jeremy's talked about problems with design. So my question was, is it endemic? And you talked about, you helped me a lot by saying, there was a great suggestion, but like all good suggestions, it got shot down. So to rephrase my initial question, is the political system incapable of coming up with hard decisions that will cause compromise by several parties to address problems whose major implications are sometime in the future?
Well, you've asked a fairly small question, which is,
I always do.
will American democracy thrive, or would a better system be state-controlled capitalism as in China?
Right.
And the next 50 years will give you an answer to that.
No, wait a second. But so Germany, for example, they have a pay-as-you-go Social Security system. They've put in these basically what I was suggesting we should have, which are these sort of actuarial correction factors that are linked to mortality and because they saw the same demographic problems. Actually, theirs were coming along a lot faster than ours. So I don't know, this may be a question about the U.S. political system. Germany has a bit more of a history of sort of technocracy, if you will, and was able to get that kind of thing through. It may be the current political environment, the bipartisan, the two-party system. I think we need some political scientists in here to answer that question.
Bismarck invented Social Security.
Yeah.
So Germany
should
had
be able to
a
fix
learning
it.
curve that was
They should
well
have
ahead
a
of
learning curve that
us.
was ahead of ours. They should be able to fix it, yeah.
Okay, so there's all these political incentives to mismeasure, and at some point, bill has to come due. First, how much will taxes have to be raised for currently for this to happen, for us to be able to pay it to keep the system going? And or because if we go bankrupt, right, we're going to have all this social unrest. Then there is another way, right, to lower the future liabilities, inflation, right? If you have inflation, that will definitely lower your current liabilities. So what do you think about
To some extent.
the
Except for the indexing. In the corporate sector, what you just said is absolutely true. But in the public sector, we index the benefits for inflation.
But not all of them.
Not all of them, and not
many. I
fully.
mean, California, for example, they're not indexed to inflation. They just have a 3% inflator on them every year, regardless. So on the inflation point, would inflation help? In some places, 10% inflation per year would help. In other states, it wouldn't. And to answer your question about how much would it cost, I mean, Novi Marks and I have done these calculations. How much would taxes have to increase to achieve fully funded systems over 30 years? And that varies a lot by state. In Illinois, it's 1,800. In New York, it's 2,500. In Florida, it may be on the order of what is it, 800. But then you have to get into these questions of, well, are people then going to move from one state to another?
And then, would there be an incentive then not to index them to inflation anymore? Because then, I mean, people don't know about finance that much, right? So you have your average firefighter, he doesn't know, all of a sudden you say, next year public pension plans will not be indexed to inflation, and then getting into the whole Social Security question, Medicare, Medicaid with our federal debt, we definitely, I think, have an incentive to, at some point, inflate a little bit. Do you see that as something, I mean, not getting too much into
my generation has been robbing you guys since you were born. There is a moral justice in increased inflation which will allow you to rob us back a little bit, because inflation has the biggest impact on fixed income retirees or people with fixed assets to support them for the rest of their lives, and a little inflation would go a long way towards getting you guys even.
Yeah, but Social Security, though, I mean, is indexed. It's not going to help Social Security, right?
And it's indexed also on the wage base, so that
Final pay is.
Final pay is.
Yeah.
Final pay component.
Following on the topic of inflation, George, do you think that private pension funds are implicitly tied to extreme inflation? If inflation, spikes to 20%, companies like GE might say, we know it wasn't tied to inflation, but nobody expected this, and so at this point, the benefits become, not doable. So, do you think
De facto link to inflation? Is that what you're asking? I don't think so. I mean, I think they may give some COLA, it's all going to be part of a negotiation with labor, but they didn't have a COLA before, and maybe they have only a very modest COLA now. I don't know what GM has, but they either have a very modest COLA or no COLA, which means that they're already not keeping up with inflation. So they probably wouldn't keep up with inflation then. It's hard to predict what would happen, but I doubt that they would give enough COLAs to make up for hyperinflation. They would probably be fairly pleased with that situation.
As somebody said, you don't get what you deserve, you get what you negotiate. So they may or may not get it. We had raging inflation in the late 70s, early 80s before Volcker tightened down. And as a practicing actuary in those days, we were designing all kinds of ways to protect retirees against the damage that had been done. The most common approach was what's called an ad hoc COLA, ad hoc cost of living adjustment, where the board of directors would say, we're going to increase every retiree's pension by 2% multiplied by the number of years since they retired. And we were busy designing those all over the place, and some daring people even talked about putting automatic COLAs into the corporate pension plans. And for actuaries, that made a lot of sense. And probably, fortunately, for the corporations, it didn't make that much sense. They didn't want to lose control, so they continued to do ad hocs until inflation became less of a problem. So there is some responsiveness, but the other thing to remember, of course, is that in 1980, 1981, despite raging inflation, our economy, in a productive sense, was doing better than it is likely to do in the next few years. And I think we had a trade surplus, or at least we had a flow of funds surplus. We were in much better position for these corporations to be generous. And by the way, as a stockholder, I would say you're being pretty damn generous with my money to give a penny to retirees who no longer work for you. And of course, the rejoinder to that is, yes, but that has a good effect on my workforce, so that's why I do it. But, I don't think we're going to see them again. I don't think we're going to see those kind of adjustments. So inflate away and get even.
But that won't get that. I don't think that will solve a lot of the intergenerational. I don't think that's a good strategy for getting even, because of Social Security, Medicare. These things are
insulated.
Are insulated.
Yes.
It may be a way of dealing with some of the fixed DB
Yes.
issues.
Yeah, I mean, I'm semi-facetious in telling you that that's But some amount of inflation will favorably redress some amount of intergenerational imbalance. One little just sort of factoid to tell us how we're talking about public pension plans and how they're mismeasured using 7.5%, 8% discount rates and all the things that flow from that. And I don't know what your latest figure is, 2-3 trillion of underfunded when we measure it. 4 at market. Dwarfed by this is a mere $400 billion shortfall in what are called multi-employer pension plans. The Teamsters, the coal miners, all kinds of people, they have a $400 billion shortfall. And they are an exception under the Pension Protection Act when every other corporate pension plan had to go to a so-called market rate of interest. They are continuing to use 8% discount rates, protected by statute. And so they've got their $400 billion deficit, which has enormous parallels. And the idea that they're 10% of the public plan problem is probably a constant. But in their own right, that's not a small thing. So I just want you to know that they exist and that they've got their problems, and they too are mismeasuring as a way to solve their problems.
Now, the federal government is explicitly on the hook for those, right?
No, the guarantees under the PBGC for multi-employer plans are about 1/3 or 1/4 of what they are for single-employer plans.
But the federal government is on the hook for them.
You mean beyond the PBGC?
The
No.
PBGC
Well,
itself.
no, because right now under PBGC, you can get a pension if your company goes bankrupt. They'll make you good up to $65,000, $70,000.
Oh, you're saying the limits are low.
15,000,
15,000, I see.
18,000.
I see.
Okay, so yeah, they're on a hook, but the employees are very much on
Employees
that
are very
hook.
much on that hook.
And their employers, because the guy who owns a small trucking company is not General Motors, and he's not Bill Gates. He's going to pay for some of this, and so are his employees.
Are any of the three of you worried that states like Illinois and others that were on the bad boy list could start a campaign in Washington, let's create a public PBGC?
There's already been some murmuring about that, and I think that we've seen that. So the PBGC is the sort of, it's like the FDIC for corporate pension plans. So when United Airlines went bankrupt, what happened to the pensions? They were taken over by the PBGC, which is an entity of the federal government. And yes, that has been one proposal that has been floated. And I mean, I think we have to look at how the PBGC, did in stabilizing or not the corporate sector, and ask seriously whether that's a good idea or not. I tend to think not.
I thought that in one of your papers, you advocated, I may be saying something too strong, some form of federal bailouts, either as an undesirable but necessary future regime, or have you done such a thing?
Dick Reardon misinterpreted one of my writings and said, when he proposed,
he said you said.
He proposed the PBGC for, essentially a PBGC for the public sector, and said that I was in favor of that. And because he's somebody who is much more widely read than I am, that seems to be something that's crept into popular opinion. But as I wrote on a blog that maybe a couple hundred people read compared to the million who read Reardon stuff, that's not the case.
Okay.
What I proposed was that the federal government have some kind of incentive for state and local governments to do pension reform. And that incentive could be in the form of additional tax breaks for bond issuance, in the form of some kind of resurgence of the Build America bond type model, or possibly also the use of tax deductible pension obligation bonds as a carrot to offer that you only get if you do pension reform. That was what I came up with. He said, Rao wants a federal entity, which is not
Sorry.
Yeah. No, that's all right. I'm happy to have every opportunity to clarify that for the 100 people who are in this room, and the two that will watch the video afterwards.
One of the limitations on any federal efforts to help Illinois, to help California, is if I'm a citizen of North Carolina or an elected official in North Carolina to Congress, why should Carolina pay for all the mistakes of Illinois?
Well, this is interesting because I think that I'll be the amateur political scientist. Part of that will help such a program, and whether it's a PPGC or any program, there's going to have to be a wealth transfer, right? There'll be a government fund that will backstop these things, but some people will come in with bigger liabilities than others, and there'll be rules that make you behave on a going forward basis. But if you go through that list of places where pension plans are horribly underfunded, many of them are swing states. I mean, so maybe they're.
List up again?
I thought most of them were blue states. In fact, I heard a Republican argument, I think on Fox News, that if you look at all the pension problems, they're in states controlled by Democrats.
Surprised that you watch Fox News, Jeremy. I didn't know that.
Somebody has to do it.
Well, Illinois used to be a swing state, but I mean, right, so I mean, just to guess, you know, when you look at those maps, can you win the presidency without any, or would any of those first 5 or 6 or 10 help you win the presidency, I guess that would.
Illinois blue, Kentucky red, Connecticut blue, Louisiana purple, New Hampshire purple. So I guess you have a couple of purples there.
Yeah. Right.
But then Mississippi, Alaska, red, 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 blue. I don't know about Indiana. Well.
But any public, you know, federal program, I think would include some wealth transfers to the people on the left from the right. The question is that manageable?
I mean, if you look at Congress, the incentives of Congress, I'm not really sure. It's not really a party issue. I think we pretty much, again, I'm being an amateur political scientist here as well, but I think that's why. But I think we pretty much understand that most, you know, elected members of Congress, regardless of the party, have an incentive and a desire to transfer resources from other constituencies to theirs, and that's one of the reasons that they're elected to go to Congress. So it may be just a cross-partisan.
Maybe get a question. Bryn has a question.
So it's geography, not ideology.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
Does a public PBGC not introduce just moral hazard in general and push the direction the other way and incentivize these states to continue using the wrong discount rates?
Yeah, that's the main reason that I'm against it, is that it would just basically codify the notion that the federal government is on the hook for the losses, and so you know, why should they change their behavior? Now, I think if you look at the way the PBGC was implemented for the corporate sector under ERISA, it was a bit of a trade-off. We're going to provide this insurance, but we're also going to regulate, and we're going to make you pay premiums, although they are premiums that are vastly less than the actual value of the insurance, and we're going to tell you we're going to regulate your accounting, and we're going to make you have to fund this thing on some kind of actuarial basis. Although that has also been chipped away at over time by you know, what I would say are vested corporate interests. So I think if we put a PBGC in place for the public sector, we should expect all the problems that the private sector has had resulting from that, but probably considerably worse given the incentives.
You know, when you look at that kind of institution, it's unfortunate if you sort of automatically are going to say, well, this is a salvation organization, or this is just another moral hazard cesspool. How it's done makes a big difference. It seems to me that there's little doubt that the FDIC has had a positive effect on Americans willing to trust their money to banks.
Although I would argue it's gone too far. I mean, with
$250,000
deposit limit, you know, who's got $250,000 deposits? Those are investors that should have the wherewithal to monitor what banks are doing. So
that's sort of a second order, but the point is the FDIC has not caused, because of the strong regulatory structure generally, they have not caused great moral hazard in the banking industry. And they have given depositors, you know, well, okay, we'll just agree to disagree.
That's fine.
But you're not going to say that every guarantee organization is inherently a cesspool of moral hazard, and I'm not going to say that any such organization is free of moral hazard.
Right.
Okay.
For sure.
But I think that one of the interesting things about the moral hazard issue with the federal oversight of the pension plan public pension system, is look what's happened, and Josh alluded to this, but let's make it clear. The PBGC ERISA rules, whenever we're in an economic slowdown, or it's a specific industry that's sucking wind, those things get relaxed, right? We change the funding rules, we change the funding requirements because they're a drag on the economy. And if we had this at a federal level, as soon as tax receipts go down and paying these receipts to this federal system become onerous, then the politicians will
Come in and likely
relax
relax the standards, which is what's happened with PBGC and ERISA. The standards, they get relaxed as soon as the company started complaining. But from my view of it, and Jeremy, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but in the 90s, it seemed like that ERISA and the PBGC, that they basically had it right. I mean, they had these deficit reduction contributions in there. They were funding a treasury at a treasury yield curve, and then they just chipped away.
It began in 2002.
Yeah.
When they had one of the funding relief programs. They had another one in 2004. Then they tilted backwards and strengthened things with the PPA, which got us not quite as far back as what we'd given up. What infuriated me was the arguments in favor of relaxing minimum funding. And I'm trying to remember the name of the senator from New Hampshire, Judd Gregg, who I think should have known better. The argument was made and repeated by people like him that these pension contributions are destroying jobs. And if you look at an individual company and they got to put cash in their pension plan, arguably they can't hire as many employees. But if you think about where that money goes, it's going into capital assets. It's going into stocks and bonds and lowering the cost of capital for companies across the country. And so what it is doing is what capital markets are supposed to do. It is taking resources away from those companies with poor prospects for new employees and their productive capacity, and turning it over to those companies with a greater capacity. And yet here was Judd Gregg attending only to the interests, say, of a heavy industry, of a General Motors or an airline, and saying you're going to cost jobs if you make them fund. But across the economy, it must have the opposite effect, in part because there's a tax deduction for these contributions. And so they are reducing taxes, which is stimulative to the economy, not contractive. And the allowing you to lower your contributions was actually contractive economy-wide. And the same thing is true now under MAP 21, which is another form of the same thing. By not getting these tax deductions, we are raising taxes. We raise taxes, we're obviously acting in a contractionary, not a stimulative fashion. So whether it was a good idea or a bad idea to provide funding relief, I would, for one, was infuriated by the idea that funding relief was portrayed as a jobs bill.
Well, I'm going to ask the panelists maybe to make a few summary remarks at the end. Marj will go first. But if anybody now has, speak now for a whole piece, and they have any questions they'd like to ask, please do so.
I just want to go back to the analogy you drew, Dr. Gold, between the PBGC and the FDIC. With the FDIC, it seems that the people who are going to be made whole need to have faith in the financial system are the same people who are on the hook, right? It's the taxpayers who are going to be bailing out things, but they also need to have faith that they're going to get their deposits back. However, if you have a PBGC or the public pensions, the people who are going to be made whole are the employees, where the people who are on the hook are the taxpayers. Is that not sort of changing?
No, I think that's a very important point, and I agree with you. I was only concerned that we not assume that anything that provides a safety net or a guarantee is inherently wrong. It should not be done. What you've just demonstrated is it has to be done thoughtfully, it has to be managed carefully with a great deal of discipline to avoid the fact that every one of these institutional guarantees does invite moral hazard. So you're absolutely right, but it does, on balance, they may or may not be worth having. And FDIC, I was arguing, was worth having. PBGC, I guess you could say, The jury may still be out, I don't know.
Well,
Just a sort of closing question is, what do you think the most likely solution to this whole problem is going to be in the next few years? We talked about a whole bunch of different possibilities, maybe a publicly guaranteed organization for pensions, maybe inflation rates, maybe taxes. What do you think is going to happen?
That's such a big question. I'd like to give this guy a chance to ask him, and maybe we can collect 2 or 3 questions, because you're trying to reach a conclusion here, right?
Right, yeah.
And you ask a question and we could do another half hour on. Let's get a couple of these on the table.
Mine's just more of an observation. It seems like just adding a little bit of personal responsibility to both the Social Security and the public pension seems like it could solve a lot of issues. Something you brought up in the beginning was that, people don't want to start retiring yet or start saving for retirement at 25, but you've sort of accepted that. We're giving up, maybe 20, 30 years of compounded interest on returns with the excuse that, people just don't want to self-educate themselves on retirement. It seems like both that and education about the discount rates, both of these, just adding that education factor can solve most of these issues pretty quickly.
Well, you guys are pretty intellectually elite, so you can understand those arguments. But I don't think you're fully representative of the public we're talking about. But your question...
But I think
Josh, once, Josh, would you repeat what you said, which I think speaks to that? You said earlier it's difficult to negotiate with someone who doesn't, how did you say that? Understand the benefit?
No, that it's hard to make someone understand something when their own
Upton Sinclair.
when their own salary or welfare depends on their not understanding it.
Yeah, and that's Upton Sinclair's quote, and it's a fabulous quote. You asked the biggest question, which is how's it all going to end? Yeah. And that's a good thing to let each of us in turn answer
To wrap up with
as best we can how it's all going to end.
I'll let Marj go first, and I'll give her a chance to collect her thoughts and provide some insight personally from Jack's question. So I've had opportunities in the last several months to listen in on phone conversations with plan sponsors, those people who put pension plans together, or companies that have recently frozen their DB plans and are now offering defined contribution plans. And if you listen to the people who are the fiduciaries and who put those DC plans together, they're very good people, and they know their workers, and they're terrified about the portfolio choices that those participants are going to make. And that those people have grown up in a DB world, and they think that they're going to have these benefits when they retire. And the DC plan is even better now because they can roll the dice and they'll always win. And so, the people who work very closely with workers are very skeptical and very anxious and looking to develop products that have guaranteed income and to coach their workers to doing those, basically to put them in DC plans that replicate the DB plans they had before.
I think progress will come on the public side, and I think you can see it in what you read in the papers, that gradually people are coming to understand. But I think the education issue, granted, you understand a lot of the sophisticated arguments, particularly in the way that Jeremy and Josh present them. But I always think there is a way to restate all of those arguments so that anybody, whether they're economists like us or not, can understand it, number one. And number two, I think the political realities for unions and versus taxpayers are gradually getting there. Do I think Illinois and Detroit are going to make out fine? Their problem is a lot bigger and needs to be addressed more quickly, whether or not. But maybe I'm just inherently an optimist and a glass half full person. But I think that we have the capacity to do it if we're willing to do it, and it does mean change. The education of people to take care of their own DC plan, as opposed to kind of sitting there waiting, growing older, waiting for their DB plan to come, that change will come, but slowly. I still think the glide path is smooth. It's steep, but it's smooth.
I'll let Josh go last. What's your take on this.
I guess I must be a glass half empty kind of person. I think you guys should be screaming bloody murder.
Yeah.
I think this is going to not end well. If it's stretched out long enough, the pain may be tolerable, but it's going to be an enormous amount of total pain. One of the key features of Chapter 9, and I'm not saying everybody's going into Chapter 9, is how it differs from Chapters 7 and 11 in the corporate, which allows you to restructure and so on. Chapter 9 is a very limited chapter, but it really reflects what's going on here. Chapter 9 only allows you to allocate pain. And in fact, the entire political discourse about these public plans, about the citizens and about the workers, is a political battle over who's going to bear how much of the pain. And in fact, there are always three parties. They're the taxpayers, the bondholders, and the employees. They're all going to bear some pain. And at least if the past were a predictor of the future, the unions will be better stewards on the behalf of the employees, and so more of the pain may be borne by the other two groups. But the employees will bear more pain than they ever thought possible. And it will be, in total, a tremendous amount of pain.
Josh, I look at this, is this
half full or half empty?
Here's, I wanted to say that I actually don't think the glass is half full. I don't think it's half empty. I think it's empty. Okay, actually, I'll qualify. I think there might be a drop of water left in the glass. So, and I'll just try to wrap it up with this one anecdote. So, in California, city of San Jose, which is the second biggest city in California, Mayor Chuck Reed proposed a pension reform, and one of the ways that he convinced people to vote for his idea was he showed a graph where costs to the per policeman, per uniformed police official, were going steadily up over the last 10 years, and the number of uniformed policemen on the street were going down. And when you decompose those costs, you see that it's all going to pensions. Okay, so he showed this crowd out, which is what we're seeing everywhere, the crowd out of having to pay down these legacy liabilities, pensions for public employees, are crowding out services that people depend on. In Detroit, we saw this with 911 response times taking 54 minutes. Okay, so that's what he showed. And what happened to his initiative? He was able to pass an initiative that involved some reforms, not defined contribution plans for new employees, some changes to the structure of the defined benefits, some potential requirements of employees having to pay more into the pension system themselves. What's happened? It's gotten all tied up in courts. Chuck Reed is, I think, rightfully hailed as a politically very courageous figure because he took this on. But he did about as good of a job as I could imagine a political figure doing under the circumstances. And frankly, it didn't get very far. He tried to bring this to the state level with a state constitutional amendment, and it got shot down by other mayors who said that these measures would, quote unquote, increase their costs because they'd have to recognize the fact that they have these unfunded liabilities. Kind of like saying, if I had a credit card debt of $100,000 and I didn't recognize it yesterday, if I recognize it today, it's going to increase my cost because I'm going to have to start paying it down. So the point that I want to make is that even instances where we've had a lot of political courage by Mayor Reed in this example, where we've illustrated to people, here is the crowd out, the money is going to pensions, not to keeping you safe, not to helping you sleep at night. Even in those instances, in states where the political climate is fairly dysfunctional, we have not gotten very far. What is the one drop in the glass that I see? I actually see the only drop as being some kind of federal government action of some sort. And they've been dancing around this. The Treasury has now got a division that's devoted to looking at this brand new division, looking at state and local government issues because they're concerned it's going to become a federal government issue. So to me, that would be the federal government actually getting involved with this issue, particularly people from those states on the right who are worried about having to bail out those states on the left and saying, hey, some kind of bipartisan coalition says we don't want to do this. That would, to me, be the one thing that would rescue us from a great deal of pain. I think it's inevitable that there is going to be a great deal of shared pain, one way or the other. So I agree with Jeremy on that.
I want to thank our panelists, and then they'll be here for a while afterwards. If you want to come down. conversation. But thank you guys and gals.